Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HPL seminar this week. I am very excited to announce that we have an invited guest speaker today. Ziska, could you please give us an introduction about our speaker?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Jos Vanrenterghem, Associate Professor in Biomechanics in the Faculty of Movement and Rehabilitation Sciences at the KU Leuven in Belgium. Jos supervised me during my master's thesis at the Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, and he has been a mentor to me ever since. I still remember the first time that I met Jos when I was an undergraduate student at Ghent University in Belgium, which is the same university where he did his undergraduate all the way to his PhD and where he worked afterwards. But at the time that I met him, he was already working at the Liverpool John Moores University. And he visited Ghent to present during the International Week. Now, I can assure you that all the students who were in that lecture, including me to this day, still remember the title of his talk, which was, "If soccer would be tough, it would have been called gymnastics." Please feel free to start a discussion with him afterwards if you disagree. But his presentation was so inspiring to me that that was the moment when I knew that I wanted to pursue a master's in sports and clinical biomechanics in Liverpool. And during my time in Liverpool, I gained my passion for research. So I am extremely excited that Jos agreed to stay up until midnight in Belgium, where he is now an associate professor in biomechanics to present at the HPL seminar today. The main focus of his most recent research has been musculoskeletal loading mechanisms of the lower extremities in dynamic sporting activities. An important part of his work, though, is to support the biomechanics community with improving data analysis methods. For example, in close collaboration with Dr. Mark Robinson at the Liverpool John Moores University and Dr. Todd Pataki at Kyoto University, they have over the past 15 years introduced statistical parametric mapping into biomechanical research. And as you may have heard of statistical parametric mapping before, it allows upgrading hypothesis testing for handling the multidimensionality of biomechanical data. Through his more applied work, he also intends to support practitioners in the fields of injury prevention and rehabilitation in sports, primarily working with physiotherapists, SNC trainers, and sports physicians. Now, a fun fact about Jos is that he and his family have the best and most original way of sending their New Year's wishes. Instead of sending out cards, they make an original and entertaining video, which I look forward to every year. Now today in his lecture, which is entitled Mechanotherapy Turning Movement into Medicine, Jos will take you on a semi-random walk through the forest of load management in sport and rehabilitation, focusing on biomechanical loads. Namely, many practitioners in the field attempt to carefully monitor the mechanical loads that their athletes or patients are exposed to so that the musculoskeletal system adapts optimally for the demands of the sport. This has also been called mechanotherapy. Movement is prescribed as if it were a medicine to stay healthy or to get healthy again. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jos Vanrenterghem.
Well, welcome, Francisca. That makes me blush, to be honest. It would almost even make me feel important as a biomechanist, but fortunately I'm in the company of some excellent biomechanists here who, just looking at them, make me realize that I'm not that yet. And I probably don't even have to aspire for that. I'd like to, hopefully you can all see my screen. I'd like to invite all of you to participate in the session rather than me just talking to a wall of people who are very remote and where in the way I would present, I wouldn't get any feedback. So I've got a link that you should be able to see on my screen. So if you have a second screen or a mobile phone or something, I'd then invite you to go to that link and just write your name to log on to the system there, and then you can wait until we will start using this throughout the presentation with that in the background. So maybe I can kick off straight away with a simple question. For those of you who are into sports, this will trigger hopefully some interesting outcome of the question, namely, out of these 4 athletes here, who would you admire the most if you were to admire any of these athletes? You recognize Andy Murray, you recognize Wout van Aert, who's a Belgian cyclist, you recognize Tiger Woods, and you recognize, for those of you who know the soccer or our association football, Luis Suarez. So if you can go to that link, then we'll hopefully start to get to see some people logging on and sharing their feelings about who they would appreciate or admire the most. If you say, well, I'm not into any of these sports, then obviously feel free to choose for option E. It gives me a bit of a feeling of the audience here, and hopefully this system will be easy enough for many of you to participate. If you feel like this is not for you, then don't worry, you can look in the background like we do with many of these webinars. But at least we can get maybe a feeling here of the audience. So not that many people are into soccer. Unfortunately, quite a lot of things have been based on my work with soccer. As Siska already mentioned, I've been working in Liverpool, and obviously Liverpool has a very long tradition in soccer or association football. I'm glad to see that many people admire also the cyclists, because that's obviously a Belgian national sport, which is very prominent, and this particular cyclist, Wout van Aert, is a very high flyer in the field, I would say. Okay, I've got about 24 results. That gives me also a bit of a standard of what to expect in the coming presentation. If I see, I'll wait always till I get above 20 results. Good. So allow me to then briefly provide an overview of the presentation. I will talk about load and adaptation. Then I will have a section where we will focus on trying to monitor load, in particular in the healthy athletes, to finally go towards the title of my talk, which is Mechanotherapy. But I thought I needed to take that preamble before hitting the mechanotherapy, because I think the idea of mechanotherapy can be approached from even the healthy athlete as well. So allow me to just take that detour first before we get to the essence. So load and adaptation. We start with the principle of supercompensation. So it was in the 70s of the previous century, even before I was born, that the principles of supercompensation were introduced into the field, where we basically said, or we basically have an idea that there is a certain fitness level that somebody has. With training, we impose a fatigue onto that fitness level, which means that the fitness level drops. There's a recovery phase, and then we have the amazing wonders of nature that there's actually some sort of a supercompensation taking place. If we then hit the system at that moment of supercompensation with another training stimulus, then we would hope that over time we actually can increase the fitness of our system. So schematically drawn, we have here a number of training bouts that are visualized by these bars, and our fitness level, or our adaptation, call it, would be evolving in a wave-like shape, where what we're hoping is that each time when we hit the training at a peak of our fitness recovery, that supercompensation, that we can actually introduce an increase in fitness over time, and therefore become fitter and perform better at our sports. That's a general principle that in the field is very common and is typically approached from what I would say is a physiological perspective. We're always thinking about, we need to make sure that we can have a system that has a very good engine, and the engine gets trained to better consume energy intake, to make sure that the oxygen levels are optimally used and optimally arriving at the place where they have to be used. And so it's typically an energetical aspect, a metabolic aspect that people consider in the fields. Now, what has been recently more and more prominent, particularly by technological advances, to which I'll get to in a minute, is actually that we also have mechanical adaptation. And so more and more there's been a biomechanical input into that, into those insights that people have wanted. However, the field hasn't really, I would say, advanced on that from a theoretical perspective yet. And as an example, I think we can take, for example, the notion that adaptations of musculoskeletal tissues tend to be slower, and there's a lot of extensive debate we can have about that, but they tend to be slower than what you would call the physiological adaptations that we just mentioned about, which are about metabolic turnover. Particularly based on repair of the musculoskeletal tissues. So if you then were to do the same as we did before, where you actually have a physiological number of bouts of training that you impose to the system, and at the same time you impose the system to biomechanical loads, so to speak, then you would introduce a physiological adaptation that is positive as we had before, but at the same time you would have a biomechanical adaptation that is negative, because at the time when you are hitting the second bout of training, you've not yet recovered because of that slower repair process in the musculoskeletal system. And so if you were to do that, you'd actually be in trouble. So what you might have to do as a principle is then say, well, we want to have a training where we don't hit that star point of ultimately damage, stress fractures, for example, in bones, or tendinopathies due to overload, overuse. But what we really want to maybe do is separate between these two. And so where we have maybe that same physiological number of bouts of training, we actually now modify the biomechanical stresses or the biomechanical load that we impose to the system. And at the moment when the system has not yet recovered the musculoskeletal system, we would introduce a lesser bout of loads. So we would say, well, maybe rather than having high impacts, because this is something that we all think is damaging to the system, let's try to do a training session that has the same physiological load but with low impact. Think about training in the water or training on the anti-gravity treadmill that you might have seen in the past, so that at that time we actually give a lesser fatigue to that musculoskeletal system, so that it gets the chance to recover eventually into the third training bout that we would introduce in this theoretical example. So that then we can again hit it with a higher load biomechanically to then eventually do the same again in training number 4 of a lower load, so that we can eventually allow this musculoskeletal system to repair itself and achieve the same principles of supercompensation that also are somehow valid to these systems. So it's a theoretical concept, but the question then is, well, how do we put this in practice? Because it's not just a matter of we have a physiological and a biomechanical system. If you think about the body, there are so many I would say gouges or monitors that we would have to attach to the body. We have the cardiovascular aspect. We need to make sure our lungs work well, our heart works well, because that's the provider of the oxygen that we need to get to the blood and to the muscles. We have obviously the muscle adaptations that we need to monitor, the loading to the muscle in terms of the stresses, the tendons, but also the bones, the cartilage we need to keep into account. And even if that was the simple aspect, what we also need to keep into account is potentially neural aspects that are adapting as we are training. If you think about doing a training session which is focused on heavy loading, then everybody will know who implements these training sessions into their trainings that they have to have also technical trainings to adapt the neural system or allow the neural system to adapt to the new configuration of the body. And even if that was not enough, we also have the mental aspect of the athlete that we have to keep in mind. We need to monitor how they are feeling, because that can really importantly affect hormonal responses that all are interfering in all these other aspects. So next time you go to the pub and have a debate about whether SAMS training or beach training as part of a pre-season trainings camp is good for the body, then I've hopefully given you some ammunition here to throw on the table in that debate about whether really we should be doing that or not. And I'm not going to share any opinion on whether I appreciate that or not. I think personally the most important benefit is that you have the sunlight and vitamin D in those kind of training sessions. So to round up that initial introduction, I hope that I've taken you out of your lab environment for a short session here, and that I can actually say, okay, right, monitoring loads to musculoskeletal structures may support strategic decisions. That means it may help the coach to optimize musculoskeletal functioning and minimize the risk of detrimental adaptations. And that's the theory. And as much as the principle of supercompensation is a theoretically well-accepted principle in the field, the practical implementation always remains a very big challenge. And the challenge has even increased since we've had lots of technological developments. So allow me to take you on to the second part of my presentation, which is the healthy athletes that I want to approach first. So practically, how do we go about trying to monitor loads in the healthy athletes? Well, there's a perspective paper that my colleagues from Liverpool, in fact, still, and I have written to try and help practitioners organize their minds in the minefield, literally, and forest of training load monitoring. There's a whole growth of scientific literature developing around that. And the bottom line is that you have a load adaptation pathway, which is a cyclical pathway existing of fitness and fatigue that balance each other out, which is the curve that we've been observing earlier, which you can affect by imposing an external load. So this is a term used in the field. And the external load, what does that mean? This is purely, if you think on the physiological side, if I have a training session and somebody has run a 10-kilometer run at a certain speed, then you could say, well, the average speed that that person has trained for that 10-kilometer, that is an indicator of the external load, the demand that I've imposed as a coach on my athletes in terms of what they need to achieve. This is ultimately also the dictator of their performance, if it's a runner, for example. Now, average speed has been closely linked to ultimately the energy consumption, metabolic demands, and so in that sense, it can then be matched with the internal load. So what you then do is see how the athlete ultimately responds to it, the acute response. That means an athlete who is fit will have a certain heart rate that goes with that. If an athlete gets fatigued or the fitness goes down, the heart rate, you will see that it goes up for the same training bout, for the same external load. And so by looking at the relationship between external load and internal load, you can start to appreciate as a coach how your athlete is responding to what you're doing. But ultimately, what you would really want to measure is the adaptation, because that is what you want to forecast. You want to predict if I impose an external training load onto somebody, well, hopefully nobody imposes it onto their athletes, but at least if I do a training session with my athletes, I dictate the external load, I try to predict the internal load, and ultimately in the time, I try to anticipate adaptations that come with that. And it's a cyclical path, and so the question here is, can we consider the same from a biomechanical perspective? And this is where the perspective, if you have an interest in that, would give you some insights in that. So there we could say, well, what are external loads? Taking our runner as an example again, the impact forces, the loading rates of the ground reaction forces, you could say, well, if we can identify that, then that would be an indicator of our external load. What would be an indicator of our internal load? Well, then we would probably have to go towards measuring contact forces in the joints, say, for example, or even stresses or strains in the tissues, because ultimately adaptation is governed by mechanosensitive cells in the body that ultimately they respond to strains, to stresses and strains. And so this is obviously immediately for everyone that we know, we're not there yet in the field. We need to look at it maybe from a slightly different perspective. But nonetheless, the same principle applies, that this will trigger adaptation, and we have this cycle, this load adaptation pathway again. So this is where we can start to look at external loads indicators, internal load indicators, and adaptation indicators. So now I'm going to ask you the next question. So if I was a coach now, the thing to monitor closely, the most closely, would you think that is external loads? Do you think that that's what you really want to measure the most? Do you think internal loads? Do you think adaptations, I want to measure that? Or do you think all of the above? There's also two other options, which I don't need to read out loud, but you could always obviously select those. I'm very glad to see the responses growing here in a certain trend, because I think I largely agree that we'd get a long way if we were able to measure internal loads. Because that really would mean that if we can measure those, we can try to keep an eye at least on what the dose is of what we deliver. I'm also very glad to see that a good number of people are saying all of the above, because if you're not monitoring the external loads, ultimately that is what you are dictating. Then you won't be able to identify the relationship between your external and internal load for athletes. And if you're not trying to keep an eye on the adaptations, then obviously you're going to be considered a pretty poor coach in the field. So I'm very glad with that, but I'm also, as I said, very glad to see that internal loads reach a lot of attention for people. And that's what I will focus on in the first place, because I think the starting point for this whole journey towards mechanotherapy is we need to get a handle on what the internal loads are in particular. And so there's another paper, a follow-up perspective that we've written where we've tried to help people from the biomechanical perspective. Well, what can we do in terms of load monitoring in the field? And what we've done is we've tried to categorize types of load indicators that might give us some insight into some load. On the horizontal axis, the ones that go towards the right are to do with whole body loads. So where we say, well, if we can't have an idea about tissue loads on the left-hand side, we might maybe already have a start with trying to guess whole body loads, because at least it'll give us some indication of the biomechanical impact that we've given to these musculoskeletal structures. But also what we've organized them according to is the vertical axis is, well, which of these loads do we currently or are accessible in a lab environment, and which of these loads are accessible in a field environment more towards the top. And so I'll leave this to you to choose whichever one you pick. We've also tried to identify which ones are expected to give more insight in terms of muscle, tendon, ligament, or bone cartilage loading, which then obviously would be related to those adaptations. But what you can probably already see here is a very important gap on the left-hand side top corner. There is a current lack of field-based tissue or structural load metrics. We just have not got access to those. I would say yes, because I'm hoping that that will change. And so there's another question again that will come up. We've tried in the first place to work on the top right-hand side of that picture, where we had Niels Niergaard, who was one of my PhD students, who tried to estimate from accelerometry the ground reaction forces that people might get exposed to in the fields. First trying to see, well, which accelerometer would get the closest. Do you place it maybe on the trunk, which is what you see very often happening with GPS units that are being used, or do you have to place it maybe on the shank, because that's what people in the running business would most likely consider from the tibial accelerations, etc. And what we discovered that really none of them gives you a good insight into this whole body biomechanical loading. And what you probably could do is then use a mass spring damper model, as Joe Hall's group has, for example, done. We've not been very successful in that, applying that to the field context, because ultimately the field context is way too variable and not the same as looking at a distance runner who has a very particular running style that is very repetitive and very systematic. The other work that we've done is extending that with the PhD of Jos Vanrenterghem, also at Liverpool, John Moores University, where we really try to use further insights or try to use further methods to explore this idea. Can we use wearables to ultimately predict the ground reaction forces as an indicator of whole body forces? I'm going to spare you from the detail about that, but if you would have an interest, then feel free to, for example, check out the paper that Jasper was able to write for the British Journal of Sports Medicine, where it describes an idea about what his PhD work was. So here's another question. What do you think is the future for estimating internal musculoskeletal load in sports? So we have that big gap there. What is the future, you think? Do you think we need to search for wearables? Do you think we need to search for markerless motion capture, so we can just put cameras around the field and then whatever way we can maybe get there? Maybe we might do lab experiments and then try through deep learning, understand what the internal loads are based on surrogate measures that you might be able to measure in the field. Or is it going to be a hybrid solution, or do you think that within your lifetime, whichever that expectation might be, you won't be able to see it? I can obviously see that people have a belief in hybrid solutions, but also that people have a belief in deep learning solutions, I think that's what probably is the tendency of the biomechanical field at this very moment. Is we're hopeful that with the Googles and other ventures, that algorithms are getting brighter and giving more insights as long as we get high volumes of data. And so the bottom line here from this question that I take home is that we need to get high volumes of data recorded with reference values of the internal load measures, so that we can start to train surrogate measures that might be able to give us insights into that in a field context. All right, moving forwards, here's another one. Have you ever heard of the Little League pitch count? Okay, good. The majority has not heard of it, so I'd better explain what it is. It's a little side way that I've taken because I think it's a very interesting one. Namely, what it is the Little League is baseball. Youngsters playing baseball. It's in the US. I don't know if you have it in Canada as well, but I know in the US it's obviously a big thing. And what people have discovered is that the amount of pitches that young people do running up towards becoming an adult baseball player is actually predictive of the risk of having a very common injury in baseball, which is an elbow injury. The ulnar collateral ligament gets injured, and then there's potentially a surgery that is needed to reconstruct that after injury. It's a bit like the ACL in football. I think for baseballers, it's very similar to that. And so what they found is that there's an association between the amount of pitching that you do on a daily basis and the risk that you have of at a later stage having that injury. There's debate about how strong the evidence is, but the evidence was at least strong enough to suggest that we should do pitch counts. That means that we should monitor the amount of pitches that somebody does in a day, that we set the maximum amount of pitches, and that depending on how many pitches below that maximum they have done, the number of required rest days that they need to have. So this is actually part of the competition that they have. They monitor the number of pitches, and then they dictate whether a player would need 1, 2, 3, or 4, or even up to 5 days of rest after that training day or that match day. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, because then I'm wondering, well, actually what we're doing here is we are load monitoring, and we are using it to protect the athletes. We're actually preventing injury by load monitoring. But my question now is, well, which type of load are we monitoring? So going back to previously, was this external load? Is this an indicator of internal load? Or are you lost and you want to get out of here? Okay, good. Few people are lost. I'm really pleased with that. It's an external load measure, because ultimately what we're measuring is what is the person doing. We're not necessarily measuring what the system is exposed to. So what we've done here is we've taken the option, well, not us, but I think people who decided to start doing that, is they've taken the option. We can't really know what the load is, but we know that we'll be pretty close in identifying load somehow from a musculoskeletal perspective. And so in this way, we can now operationalize or make operational the prevention of injury. And so this example is something which I think should all remind us of the fact that although as biomechanists we are keen to look into the body to the extent that we can, we should not forget that there's also potentially much easier ways of measuring and monitoring the load on the body to try and prevent injury or optimize somebody's performance. Another example is in volleyball, for example, a very popular sport in this part of the world. There you have lots of jumping, and the Patellar Tendinopathy is a very common issue in those. And as some people of you might also be aware, Osgood-Schlatter in growing athletes is a very common injury to the knee patella tendon ultimately. And so if you have jumping sports, you could do jump counts as easy as that, which is an external load measure, but it also might give you a handle on the actual loading, where the biomechanists wouldn't necessarily have to invent a way to monitor the exact loading in the field, but maybe we could circumvent that need by understanding what the relationship between jumping in that population is with internal loads, so that we can estimate the internal loads purely based on the external load measures. So that's just making sure that we keep perspective. So monitoring external indicators of mechanical load can support prevention of injuries in the healthy, potentially growing athlete. Monitoring internal load does remain a technological and scientific challenge for the future. And that now brings me to the third part of my presentation. I'm just going to keep an eye on time. Okay, doing well. That is, let's now go to this injured athlete. So the title of my presentation was Mechanotherapy. And if anyone has a particular interest in mechanotherapy, this has been used as a term in many ways in history. And actually it has lost some interest at some point, because it was used in a totally different way than the way I want to use it. And the way I want to use it is according to Karim Khan, who's the editor of British Journal of Sports Medicine, who wrote a brief review on that, and he basically claimed it to be the scientific knowledge underpinning how load may be used therapeutically to stimulate tissue repair and remodeling in the four main, I would say, musculoskeletal structures. Personally, I would like to add ligament to that as well, because I think that is actually a fifth structure that's in the current biomechanical techniques, we can even start to estimate some stresses and strains on that. And so in that sense, what I think you hopefully feel is that the prelude that I've had to go into this was already going in that direction. We were looking at repair of musculoskeletal structures, recovery, supercompensation. I think all these processes actually fit within here. If you're going to read that paper, you're going to be looking at very complex biochemical, mostly, and epigenetical type of storylines, where you look into the behavior of cells and I would say even very detailed intracellular mechanisms that lead to this repair, and how mechanical transduction or mechanotransduction, as it is called, is being created. But this left me, when I was speaking to my colleagues in the department where I work now, which is a physiotherapy department, it left me really with a huge gap between the theoretical science that is being done in that field against the practical use of this. Because what is the challenge of a therapist? Well, a therapist has a major challenge when they've suddenly had to stop the habitual loading to a tissue, say, for example, the patellar tendon now. So there is an injury that takes place. It might be an overload injury or an acute injury. There's an injury that takes place. The first thing that will have to happen, typically because of inflammation taking place for the first couple of days, is initial unloading. And then there is a very steady process that is needed of reloading, progressive reloading. And this is a very important thing with practitioners, therapists, that you need to do this very steady, because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to increase the capacity of the musculoskeletal tissue to withstand the stresses that, or the demands that it has in the daily life or the daily activities, whether that is sports or whether that's just a sedentary life. But you basically want to have that progression towards gradually returning to its full capacity. Now, we have a major problem there, because first of all, if you have to do that in real life, then you've got to guess what kind of exercises you can do to create that progressive loading. But what is more, you don't really want everything else to also go through this, because all of the other structures don't go through this healing process. It's only that one structure really that has to go through that. So all of these other structures that are there, what you would want is that they keep going through the habitual loading, and that's what is indicated here with these green arrows. So all of the other structures in other joints and the rest of the body, you want it to be exposed to habitual loading. And you only want to really change the loading according to the red curve of progressive, unloading and progressive reloading for the injured tissue. Now, this is challenging, and this is where physiotherapists with lots of expertise, depending on the status they have, that might also chip in a little bit, but they basically will say, well, we very carefully select our exercises to maximize the habitual loading in everything else but the healing structure. And there we know exactly how to modify gradually the stress on the load. And truth be told, if anyone has ever been handled by a qualified physiotherapist, they do amazing jobs. And they actually do that by using principles of progression, regression, making sure that things go gradually heavier, maybe gradually more complex. So it's a very well thought through progression that they have. But the question is though, well, this is their feeling. And very often it's a clinical intuition that they use, an expertise that they use. But is there any hard evidence that in true fact, if they are pushing someone through these progressions, that this is really delivering at that tissue level the stresses that we would expect there to be? Is that really going to be the case or not? And so let's go and do another final exercise here for the presentation, namely, for those of you who have checked the names in the people who are in the session, you might have come across the name of Michiel Hagen. It's another name that is impronounceable internationally, but Michiel is actually a PhD student who is currently working on this topic, and this is some data that he's collected. So you're looking at 3 movements here. Hopefully the video is sufficiently okay to see what these movements are. You've got a sit to stand movement, you've got a lunge movement, and you've got a step up movement. So now is my question. Let's just take the example of cartilage load. If you are trying to identify for these tasks, which of the tasks would be the task with the highest load on the knee cartilage? And I'm going to keep it open which part of the cartilage, but let's just assume the tibiofemoral joints, yeah? And so which of these tasks would be the highest loads? So I'm going to ask you to go to this poll everywhere again, and where you can rank the 3 tasks according to what you think is at the top, the task with the highest load, and at the bottom, the task with the lowest load on the knee joint cartilage. So we'll see this now develop with people ranking them, and we'll see if the ranking actually stays as it is now or if it still flips around. Let's see. Don't let yourself be influenced by other people, because you might not have the right answer there. I'll wait just a little bit and see still people responding, but the rankings are very stable, very robust. Two more. One more. Okay, good. They've not changed anymore. So here we go. This is the ranking that you propose. The sit to stand is the lowest load. The step up is the second, and the lunge is the third. So if we now have a look at this, then let's see what the result is. In fact, you were all correct. One thing that sometimes gets people on the wrong foot is the sit to stand, because people think, oh, that's quite a heavy exercise. But obviously the important thing there is that you're dividing the load between 2 limbs. And obviously the load there is lower per knee on the cartilage than 100% of the body weight. And then as you progress, you can see exercises that have a steadily increase in cartilage load. The step up has about 100% or a little bit more than 100% cartilage load of body weight, whereas the lunge then goes further up, and running obviously goes further up. So this is based on work that has been published by our colleague Sam van Rossum at KU Leuven previously, where he's basically gone through the exercise of monitoring a number of these tasks and looking at the tibiofemoral or pressure distributions, even between medial and lateral. And what he also discovered is that this is the order or the ranking of the tasks differs depending on which part of the cartilage that you're looking at. Now, this is only an example to pinpoint that it's not such an easy exercise to identify for one particular tissue what the load progression would idealistically be. But what is more, and this is where the question really is, could you come up with an exercise progression where you are maximally keeping everything that is non-injured at a habitual loading, whilst at the same time going through progressive loading of the healing tissues? And this is where there is a real challenge, and I think it's virtually impossible, but we should at least get as close as possible, because that should be the target, that should be the aim. So this is where physiotherapists currently do their best using subjective means, looking at the loading, estimating the loading, and ultimately making that estimate. What is the load versus the capacity of that healing structure, and how can I implement these progressions? They monitor primarily adaptations and responses, to be honest, rather than the actual loading, because one critical factor that is being used is the perception of the athlete or the perception of the patient in terms of pain and in terms of soreness afterwards, to try and modify how heavy they can go. And if they feel that the patient comes back with more pain, then they will reduce the load a little bit, because that's an indicator typically that they've gone a little bit too far with the exercise that they've imposed onto. But some research actually indicates nowadays that pain is not always a good indicator to start from, and that sometimes in certain cases you may actually have to go through pain. It's a whole debate that is currently going through the field, particularly around tendinopathies, but also hamstring injuries, for example, where people believe that not everyone believes that pain is a good indicator of adaptation. So ultimately, the conclusion to this part would be that the practical implementation of mechanotherapy depends on internal loading, which is not really yet being monitored. And I think what we should aim for is that we give tools somehow to the therapists, to the physiotherapists, but anyone who's involved with helping athletes go through the rehabilitation processes that are very hard, to be able to get back safely towards their habitual loading. And then there's, for the few people who might have any knowledge in football, this is where my background lies. They may know Vincent Kompany, or they may know Eden Hazard, two Belgian players who are ultimately some of the best players in the world. They both have gone or are currently going through rehabilitation in the past, where they have clearly had relapses following a major injury. And that's also something that is another point, I think, linking the very first part of my session to this latter part, that is that after rehabilitation, it's not just a matter of the rehabilitation stops and we have habitual loading again. There's still a whole process to go through, which goes from participation to sports, then ultimately going back to competition, and ultimately going back towards your highest performance level. And that's a whole very slow progress again, which very often is violated due to other external factors, such as we have the Champions League final coming up, or we have this particular event coming up, and we have to speed this process up. And that's where people are happy to speed up the process because they think the rehabilitation is over, where actually I think a lot of principles are violated of that super compensation. And so I think if you could provide tools to physiotherapists and physical coaches, so that this entire process of return to sport is aligned with the process of managing the healthy athletes, then I think we might be in a position to finally improve the support that we can give to these athletes throughout their career, rather than it being very specific to the profession that you talk to. So maybe I can just mention that I didn't talk a lot about biomechanical work. I've taken you out of your comfort zone, hopefully on an interesting journal from one or another way. These are two projects that we are currently running. The top project is actually a title of Michiel's PhD study, and another project is on ACL reconstruction, but again focusing on joint loading. Can we somehow use that internal loading, quantify that internal loading to try and improve the outcome of certain rehabilitation processes? Those are things that are currently happening in our lab. And obviously, whenever this whole COVID-19 is finished, I would welcome everybody to make a trip over from Calgary or wherever you are in the world to beautiful Leuven and come and share a fine Belgian beer with me. So this is the overview. We talked about load and adaptation, we talked about healthy athletes, we talked about injured athletes, and somewhere in between that you could have read that I'm still a biomechanist and would like to advance the biomechanical field. I'll stop sharing then, so that's...
Thank you very much, Jos. So before we get to the discussion period started, I would like to kindly suggest everyone to turn on your camera during the discussion period if you feel comfortable with it, so that we can have a more active discussion. Thank you for doing that. So if you have any questions for our speaker, Jos, please use the icon raise hand button. So if you go click reaction icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see the button, like long, thin button there. So also, if your Zoom version does not show you that the button is there, so please also feel free to send me a message via Zoom chat, then I'll call on you when it's your turn. Now the floor is open for the question. Yes, Michael, please go ahead.
Sure. Hey, Jos, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering if you could provide a bit more information about the pitch count and what data it's actually based on. How did they choose the thresholds?
Yeah, it's been a cumulative process. So if you track it back, then you will see it go back a long way in terms of epidemiological research that they've done, where they try to indeed identify pitch counts in baseball, and then they started actually from the fact that a lot of professional baseball players have this injury, which is having a major impact on their potential to perform and keep performing. And then they tracked it back towards, well, what could be the history of the athletes? And then they figured out that it was the amount of hours that somebody had spent historically that seemed to be indicative of the risk of having this injury. And what they then started to do is to ultimately try to intervene there. And they intervened, and this is the study that I mentioned in the slides. So they intervened actually and looked at, well, if we can reduce the amount of pitches, then does that actually have a link with people professionally ultimately having that injury? So it's quite an advanced pieces of jigsaw puzzles that they put together to come to this ultimate regulation that they now impose in the players. So it's a regulation that is part of the Little League, where you're obliged to provide these players with the number of rest days based on the pitches that have been counted.
Well, thank you.
Yes, Siska, please go ahead.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, Jos. I was wondering how you see the future of monitoring the internal load, and if you see more specific, if you also think that there is a future where athletes will have a lot of sensors inside their body, or if it would more be tools that you're referring to, if we would more try to estimate the internal loading from easier external loads as with the pitching, or if you also think that it could be a chance that we will have many more sensors inside so that we can directly see what's happening inside our body.
Yeah, I personally think that we shouldn't have that ambition to equip people with sensors in their body. I personally don't think that's the direction to go for measuring or monitoring internal loads. I think the direction to go is really, and I've personally been mostly impressed by the powers of deep learning. By looking at what I call second generation of markerless motion capture. So there's now a second generation of markerless motion capture, which allows you to do pose estimations based on deep learning. So training algorithms to recognize landmarks and recognize patterns on video images. To try and match poses of the body onto it. And if you look at the quality of that compared to what was the first generation of markerless motion capture, which was purely based on our typical mechanical principles, if we have a volume that we can detect, and we can put these volumes together. Then we can then fit a geometrical model inside that volume of the body to try and estimate how these. They were good, but always far from good enough, whereas the deep learning methods now seem to be really changing that field. And I think we all have knowledge of some application that has improved dramatically over time by adding data to it. So ultimately, I think that's where our future might be in trying to gather data that can be used as reference data, gather a lot of it, and then try to see if we can predict these internal loads sufficient to give an idea. Now, another thing is obviously the challenge of how sensitive do you have to be there? What are what you could call clinically meaningful differences? What are the meaningful changes that you need to be able to detect there in that circumstance? And I think this is where the question still lies open, if deep learning will be able to provide us with that or not. In terms of the overuse injuries and preventing overuse injuries, like we have the pitch count, for example, I think your detection of internal load doesn't have to be overly detailed. I think it just has to give an indication of what the accumulation of load is, to try and keep an eye on that. Just like you would, the runner will count their miles that they run in a week and use that still as an indicator of what their loading has been, even though that's a poor predictor actually of the true loading. So yeah, bottom line is, I think the future is still rather unclear, but I would personally bet on deep learning to develop, and where we can really use data and get better knowledge as data is accumulated and as we know more of it.
Yes, Benno, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very clear and structured presentation. Accelerometers are often used in the attempt to predict internal loading, and they are typically not very successful. Could you speculate about, or do you know the reasons why they are not very successful in doing that?
Why they are not very successful?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why are they not very successful? Yeah, there's obviously a number of reasons. Our experiences, well, the first thing is that the accelerometer rotates. So you've got the influence of gravity in your accelerometer that you need to somehow cancel out, because otherwise you have no directional input. And so I think if you want to know anything about directional loads on the body, that means on a segment, for example, you attach the accelerometer to the segment. You've, as long as looking at loads that are around about a factor 1 or 2 of gravitational acceleration, then you've got to get rid of that gravitational acceleration. So I think that's one issue, is that people have used gyroscopes, have used magnetometers to try and correct the signals and improve that, but they've obviously not been very good at that with implementing the gyroscopes in particular. I think it's a big struggle to really get reliable data. What's the second thing is, obviously you're attaching the accelerometer not to the skeleton, which is typically what we are needing to make our estimates. At least if we do any modeling, etc., then we always start our estimates of musculoskeletal loading from assuming a skeleton, but we're not attaching the accelerometer to the skeleton. We're attaching it to a wobbly mass that hangs on the skeleton, let alone clothing attached to the wobbly mass. And so I think there's also a level of noise that is creeping in, which is really tricky to estimate that load. And thirdly, I think the approach of getting from the accelerometry signal to the internal stress is also, people have taken different angles. So we've tried to look at certain angles, mass spring damper models, so that you try to physically match it. But also people have tried to use just simple correlations, regressions. And I think also there we can improve quite often on how to approach that, because we're ultimately very often using very limited data to try and get strong insights, which I think is a tricky one in this case. If we really want to know good insights of the relationships between acceleration signals that you're measuring on the body and some of the internal loads, I think we need a lot of data to get stronger ideas of what the sources of problems are and how we can potentially filter them out.
Thank you.
Actually, let me ask you one just an easy question. I might have missed from the beginning, but so when you show a schematic image of a relationship between the load and adaptation, and then there were two types of load. One is the physiological one, the other one is the mechanical one. And you were also mentioning about training where mechanical load is decreasing while we keep the physiological load relatively same. Because to me, it is a bit difficult to understand. So there be any practical example of training methodology that we can keep the physiological load in the same, but the mechanical load is relatively low so that we can prevent the injury?
Yeah, well, the paper obviously goes into that detail a little bit, and remember that this is first of all a theoretical exercise. It's a thinking exercise to allow particularly practitioners to think about what they're doing and to try and identify ways that they could distinguish between these largely separated from a practical perspective types of load. To be honest, they are very intertwined with each other, because all of the processes that cause this mechanotransduction are also biochemical processes that are interfering to a great extent with the physiological processes of energy, metabolic processes. So they're not separated at all, but for a practitioner, it can be useful to try and separate them out. Therapists, for example, they use this on a daily basis. They use aquatherapy, water training to reduce impact during running activities so that they can actually train the muscles and get even physiological heart rates up in a training session, but without any of the negative impacts, literally the impact forces that you otherwise have, which they assume the structures cannot cope yet with at the time. We talked about sand training. You can even go to cycling, for example. If you say, well, actually cycling is a low impact activity, no eccentric activity in the muscles or hardly any eccentric activity in the muscles. So if I want to avoid that, I could alter my training regime to a cycling regime. There's obviously loads of thoughts that go around there in those kind of ideas, but the idea is that if you think about it, you might be able to come up with approaches where you are potentially letting people rest in part of the system and still train in another part of the system based on these different adaptation times or timelines.
Thank you. I see, Walter, you have a question?
Jos, thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk very much as well. It's not my area. I'm not into assessing injuries or overuse injuries, but the one thing that I always ask people in our group, because there's a lot of people who do running injury research, is, what factor the biology plays, because you talk primarily about loading, and my example that I always give is that for a very long time I used to run with the same group of people, elite runners, you know, for multiple years. And some of these elite runners were injured 2-3 times a year, and others were injured once every 2 years, and ones were never injured, despite the fact that we had the same training plan. We did most of our trainings together. So, you know, it comes kind of down to the mileage or the pitch count. Is it really, is that the important thing, the loading, or is the injury frequency more dependent on what you're genetically given? And how do you account for that?
Yeah. From my epidemiological background knowledge that I have, but I'm also not an epidemiologist, but I've obviously been working in the prevention of injury fields for a little while now. There's really two factors. First of all, there is a genetic factor. I think a predisposedness of injury. We all know that certain injuries have a sex factor, for example, where sex might play an important role in certain biological factors such as laxity, but also hormonal factors that increase the risk of having a certain injury or having overload. We all know that hormonal factors play a very important role in certain overload injuries. But what I think is, from this type of anecdotes, the one thing that is by far the highest risk factor is having had a serious injury. So if one has ever had a serious injury that has a major impact on their system, and that is an injury which is known to have a potential of compensatory behaviors afterwards that are very hard to rule out in further life, then unfortunately that sets you up for a much higher risk, and we're talking about fourfold risks of relapses of many of these injuries, but equally well of other injuries occurring because of the compensations that you keep having. So I think that's the most important factor in if you have an athlete and you would be a coach and you would say, right, is this going to be an athlete who's going to be injured a lot or not? Is the first factor is look at the history of previous injuries. And if they've had a serious injury, then it's not guaranteed, but the chances are that this is going to be somebody who's going to be exposed to further injuries in their life, and that they're not going to be that individual anymore who's going to be going through life without any further injuries. I think that's your closest bet that you can have. You're obviously always talking about risk, and you'll always have the example that is the exception to the rule, that for anecdotal evidence and pop talks always then can overrule these conversations. But I think if you would be an epidemiologist, that would be your safest bet, I think.
The other thing that I quickly wanted to address is you talked a lot about cartilage loading in joints, and many years ago we looked at cartilage loading in the tibiofemoral and patellofemoral joint of animals, and so we pressed these joints in a machine together at various loads, and we could vary the load by about a factor of 5 without changing the average pressure, because when we applied more load, more cartilage area was recruited, and so the average pressure stayed actually about the same. And so I wanted you to maybe comment on what it means when we measure, forces in joints and then translate that into load on cartilage, whereas that little experiment seemed to show that essentially how much load you applied over a very large range didn't really change the contact pressure between the articulating surfaces. Do you have any comments to that, or any other things that you know from the literature?
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. And in fact, the same to a part applies to tendons as well. Tendons are also very good at distributing somehow and redistributing, so that the peak loads on them will not vary too much depending on the regime of stresses that you apply to them. And cartilage is particularly good in that, indeed, if it's healthy cartilage. The comment that I have about that is that that gives us a window of opportunity, I think, to not having to bother too much about getting exactly the extent or the magnitude of the load right. If we want to know something about loading mechanisms and injury risk, for example, or adaptation, what we need to get right is the repetitions of load, because the adaptations depend more so on the cartilage being repeatedly loaded rather than it's being primarily depending on the magnitude of the load. I think what we should try and estimate, I think, particularly, for example, in the project on post-traumatic osteoarthritis development after ACL reconstruction that we've got now, what we will do is we will try to estimate what is the actual loading regime that somebody has in their daily life activities on average in terms of the repetitions of loading that they get. And if you get certain activities, you will get a type of repetitions of loading. I think that will be more important in predicting potential development of osteoarthritis than the true magnitude of load. That being said, cartilage is not good at bad load distributions. So cartilage is very good if the load is actually pressing in such a way that it's distributed nicely. But if you change the direction of the load or you apply the load more locally with a high pressure, then it's not good at dealing with that. And obviously that's what we would call the pathomechanics of loading, and that's pathological loading, then that you create a small surface that gets the most of the loading to it, and then it's obviously not good at dealing with that.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up osteoarthritis. It kind of reminded me of some other work that we do on diet-induced metabolic syndrome and associated knee joint osteoarthritis, and their exercise seems to play a tremendously important role, maybe not so much because of the loading that you impose, but really of the metabolism and the inflammation that it helps regulating in that particular model, which is kind of another maybe side effect of exercise in a disease state like osteoarthritis. Do you have any comments on that? Or?
The answer should be no, because I'm not an expert in that at all. But I am aware, as you say, that indeed there is a very important factor there of your metabolism and any potential systemic changes that occur in the cartilage. As you say, they are very important because they are the ones that either support the positive adaptation that takes place or that prevent it from taking place. And obviously, if you damage the joint or damage the cartilage rather, and you want it to repair, but the repair mechanism cannot get going because the biological ingredients are not there, then yeah, you'll be in trouble because you'll very quickly degenerate. And I think that's also what in the project that we are having now, we will have to keep a close eye on. So we will actually take blood samples to look for some of these factors that are indicative of potentially bad biological processes that are taking place.
Great. Thanks again. Thank you.
Would there be any last question for our speaker, Jos? Yes, Siska, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking again about the future. If we're thinking about all these things, because there are so many factors that play a role in whether these types of load will cause an injury or not, do we have to move the current rehabilitation programs to a phase where, for example, everyone has sort of a passport with their genetics, but also history that would include all of this information, and then individualize the program much more than it's currently being done? Do you think that would be possible, that we can have a sort of description of,
I don't even think that you'd have to go that far. I think you can get a couple of key handles to personalized medicine, and I think with movement is the same. There's a couple of things that we should really get to understand what their influence is on the effect of movement. For example, body mass is a simple one, or body mass index. These are very simple parameters, but the true influence of these two parameters on your load adaptation pathways is not really known very well yet. So if a therapist would know that depending on the body mass, they might have to alter their prescription of exercises, taking those things into account, then that would help them a lot. If you speak to experienced therapists, they will all, I think, validly claim that they do that already anyway. And what we should do is provide them the real evidence on those influencers or those influencing factors. I'm not sure if you'd have to go too far in genetics and you know, blood samples that you would take to drive your or exercise programs. I think that we're probably looking at it a little bit too detailed, to be honest. I think we need to just look at some simple aspects. Other aspects are obviously anatomical things, and this again is where most physiotherapists will keep an eye on. Q angles, for example, is already one of those factors that people will immediately look at when they prescribe exercise to try and make sure that they estimate what the impact is of these exercises for somebody with maybe a high Q angle, for example. I don't know if that was an answer to the question, Siska, or...
Yeah, thank you.
Would there be any last final question for our speaker? If not, I would like to thank Jos again for giving a talk, even though it is very late night in Belgium. For the next week's seminar, we will be hearing from Colonel Leuven. He'll be talking about the relationship between dynamic inconsistencies and soft tissue dissipation in inverse dynamics analysis of human walking. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you all next week.